Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of Show Me SaaS. Really appreciate you joining the session today. Today, we're digging into a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and one that you'll hear us talk about all the time across the sort of SaaS landscape, which is identity, right? Like identity, you'll hear from us how essential identity is, and it's sort of ironic because I think when a lot of people think about identity, think, yeah, I've got an identity provider, I do authentication, I do authorization, and my SaaS app will have to do that. So sure, I'll use one, but hopefully after our session today, you'll see that that sort of the worlds of multi-tenancy and what it means to be multi-tenant and to have tenant context very much collides with this notion of identity, and those two kind of have to be meshed together in a way that will really let you sort of affect the entire sort of landscape of your own architecture and how identity sort of weaves its way into that entire experience. So before we sort of dig in, I just, like as usual, we're joined here today by Toby Buckley. Toby's been in and around SaaS on the team doing a bunch, including EKS reference architecture and so on. And Bill Tarr. Bill, say wave your hand here a little bit. Welcome again to the show. And these two both have been in and around this topic a ton. And our goal today is to sort of set the stage a little bit by just talking maybe a little higher level about the role of identity at first, and then we'll actually get into some nuts and bolts code here. We'll sort of talk about what some of these solutions look like, what some of the trade-offs are, what some of the things are that you ought to be thinking about. But I guess maybe I'll start first by, I've said that identity is so important and it's such a big piece of this. Maybe I'll just jump to you, Toby, here a little bit, put you on the spot. Like, you've obviously been in these solutions, you've done it, like, and maybe came from the outside even and hadn't really sort of thought about some of this. Why do you, as you talk to other customers and you talk to other people about identity, why is it sort of why do we sort of position it, or why do you view it as something that's sort of fundamental to SaaS solutions?
Well, I think it we touched on this a little bit on the first episode too. It's kind of what underpins everything with respect to the SaaS nature of stuff, right? Like, how can you protect assets and resources from other tenants if you don't know who they are? How do you kind of flow tenant context if it's not inside identity, right? That's kind of part and parcel with one another. So I think it's just getting that story right. And then also there's just so many different ways to do it, right? Like there's if you're going to host it just yourself, or maybe the tenant that you're bringing on has their own kind of provider, and you want to kind of somehow SSO into your environment. So there's just a number of different ways to do it. You got to get it right, and then set yourself up for success there.
Sure. And Bill, I know, like early on in your time here with the team here, you sort of got into the isolation story, but even as part of looking at isolation, you can see how identity and isolation end up being sort of intertwined. Any context you want to add around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anyone who's seen some of our publications about dynamic policy generation, or perhaps how you take that identity and use that to isolate services, probably this should resonate with you, should already start to sound familiar. But really, just boiling it down to one concept, it's tenant context you're looking for there, Todd, right? It really is about how do you tell everything within your application, not just who the user is, because we're all used to that. I mean, anyone who's ever worked on an e-commerce solution or any other solution, you always have an idea of who's logged into your system. But it becomes even more important in a SaaS solution to have more context than just who you are, but the context of what tenant you belong to, and using that identity, that tenant context, and having that proliferate through your whole system so it's available to all of the pieces of your architecture really is the backbone of how we make a SaaS solution flexible and extensible enough to really be manageable. And the identity is the backbone of that story, right?
Exactly. Very well said. There is, and that is, you'll hear me at least, I'll refer to sometimes as a SaaS, what I'll call a SaaS identity, which is, to me, is taking that notion of who you are as a user and connecting it to which tenant you're together, and then flowing that through your application as your tenant context. So you'll hear us use that phrase, tenant context, over and over again, because tenant context it needs to be at the fingertips of almost everything you're doing inside the building of a SaaS solution. Maybe if you think about like some people will think about, hey, I want to go build this SaaS solution, and they're saying, well, I'm all interested in my microservices. Go ahead and think about whatever you need to do on that identity side. I'm going to go away and write my microservice. Toby, from my point of view, you can't really write a microservice in a multi-tenant environment without somehow factoring in tenant context to that. Do you obviously across the solutions you built, you've probably seen how that's had to influence the way you built a microservice?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I mean, depending on the stack and depending on, number of factors, you can make that harder or easier, right? I think one of the things we advocate is trying to kind of extract those cross-cutting concerns into a library or maybe a sidecar, some kind of package of code that you could use in a lot of different places. We've got a couple examples of that. I think I'll even show some of that later today. But yeah, having the ability to just like anything in code, right? If you do something more than twice, you should kind of factor that out and try to make that a first-class thing. We try to do that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting in that at one moment I will be saying tenant context influences all of these things, and then at the same time you'll hear me say, by the way, do what you can to hide that tenant context away from your developers as much as possible. Yeah. So this is where the libraries and the other mechanisms we have. So when I'm going to do isolation, I don't want every developer figuring out how to extract the tenant context and apply the isolation. This is where the library we built that Bill built really helps with that problem, right? A lot of the tooling our team provides is about saying, how can you sort of make all that just work so that the developers don't have to have awareness of it. But if you still step back from the microservice, how they log, how they apply isolation, how they do all the things they do, they still rely on that tenant context. Yep. And in a lot of our content, we talk about the way that gets conveyed through, and obviously depending on which identity model you're using, which authentication flow, which standards you're following, it could vary. But a lot of this comes down to a JOT token in our examples you'll hear us talk about. And maybe Bill, you can talk about the role of that JOT token and how it kind of influences how this context gets shared.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, in some ways, if you want to think of it like a shibboleth or something where it's a common language that all of our applications can speak, that JOT token has really become the cornerstone of how we think of identity in modern SaaS solutions, not even just SaaS solutions, but especially in SaaS solutions. That, a JOT token essentially is just a bunch of claims, right? At a high level, the standard that declared JOT tokens really called out, hey, we can pass around this packet of claims and we can verify that those claims are exactly as we thought they were when they were originated from somewhere else. So if we have an identity provider and they vend one of these JWT tokens out, when I get them, I can guarantee that the contents of that are exactly what the identity provider suggested they should be. So I can trust that that identity is exactly what I thought it was, and I can look at the introspect on the claims there, tenant, a type of role that this particular user has, whatever else we might put in there. We can trust that and pass that through our whole system and use that as the trusted source of all of these pieces of information that it's going to have so many different downstream effects on our entire application from there.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the JOT token to me became this sort of little bit of gold. I just saw what people were doing with microservices, and they had this fundamental problem with just microservice to microservice. How do I sort of not have to look up this context over and over again? And then, and so to me, that was already sort of prevalent across the microservice. Like if I've got thousands of microservices, I want to share that context in a way. And the JOT token gave me a way to just inject that into the requests naturally. Yeah. And meant, more importantly, I wasn't leaving the microservice and creating some bottleneck to go look something up over and over again, which is I built that system, and we spent an awful lot of our time just optimizing these lookups. And you're like, that is not where I should be spending my time cleaning up. So for me, the fact that I could inject it and flow it along a natural sort of path that was just natural to my interaction across these microservices. And then, oh, by the way, now I can embed that tenant context in there. Awesome. Now I get that goodness there. I will say, maybe I'll throw a question at you, Toby, since we're doing a little ping pong here between you and Bill. Where's the line maybe between what should be in that identity in terms of my SaaS identity. Like I could have my role in there. I could start to say, well, I could put all these claims in there. Where do I draw the line between what should be in my SaaS identity and what might be other attributes that are just part of my application's notion of what I can do in terms of roles, in terms of which features and functions I might be able to access in an application, right? Like classic, maybe RBAC kind of stuff, right? Do I shove all that into the claims along with all this SaaS identity, or is that resolved somewhere else?
I think you'd have to, well, I mean, I don't, you maybe set me up here
no, I put you on the
beat
spot.
me up.
That's totally fair here, but I mean, I'm just curious. So there's not necessarily an absolute black and white to this, but where are you thinking the boundaries are?
No, I mean, I feel like claims themselves should be used to assert certain attributes about a user, right? So email address and perhaps tenant identity and all those things that are kind of immutable for a user. When it comes to RBAC and what that user can do, that seems to be a little more, that's a little more organic and probably a little more dynamic, and it could change minute by minute, second by second. And so you might want to look elsewhere for that kind of information. So me personally, I would advocate for not packing all of that into the JOT, and letting another system on top of that. And, the JOT's really to establish who you are, and then handle authorization at a level beyond that.
How about you, Bill? Like you have a point. We certainly didn't prepare ahead of time what a policy is on this. What do you have? What advice would you give around this?
I mean, the first thing I'd call out, there is a size limit on a JOT token. I think it's like 7 or 8K. So off the top of my head, you really don't want to get into a position where you're putting these different claims into the JOT token and finding out that next one you want to add is the one that's not going to fit into your JOT token, or have some variable length, claim in there that sometimes breaks and sometimes doesn't. So I would very much think of this as a vehicle for top level decision-making points. Tenant is obvious. From there, really make a case-by-case decision. I think our serverless reference architecture had some really nice opinions on, user roles and other things that you could include in there, perhaps pricing tier as well. But those are very top level decision points, right? Sorry, Toby, go ahead.
No, I was just affirming that. I think tier is definitely something that would probably be in that bucket.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what for me. I would never make absolutes about what should or shouldn't be there, but the trend I will sometimes see is people are thinking, hey, I've got an identity there. It already is attached to this user and has all this goodness to it. I'm going to shove all this application sort of context in there. And for me, it almost comes, even if it could handle as much as you threw in there, it's not really the home for it, just based even on how frequently it changes, right? Like if I really am introducing features and functions to my application, and I've got to now go define new RBAC policies for which kinds of users, or I'm introducing a new role, you're going to just see all kinds of transient behavior there, where the nature of those policies and the nature of those roles are going to be churning all the time. And you want that mechanism not to be managed and maintained to me by your identity provider, versus, hey, this is my contract with the system in terms of who I am as a user and what am I at a baseline allowed to get into, right? That to me is where I draw that line. But and so then you really get into application stacks and other things to figure out how do I then connect that identity, because I still have the problem of I've got the JOT, but I still now have to connect it to whatever other language or stack or mechanism I end up using to represent my RBAC. But probably a bit of a tangent here.
Hey Todd, we've got some interesting comments coming up from the field here. Sure. Is it all right if we bring a couple of these up, maybe?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, let me start with this one. And how do you pass it around, and do all parts of the system get the JOT token itself? And Todd, I'll turn that one back over to you first and see if you have an opinion on that.
Sure. So the sort of the standard way that we have done this is essentially, and obviously this sort of assumes that you're in a REST model, right? Which is what a lot of these services are. But obviously, if you're not, this doesn't fit for you. But in a classic sort of HTTP REST kind of model, this is where we will take the bearer token and we will essentially you'll even see maybe as part of showing code today, you'll even see where this shows up, where we essentially insert that JOT token as the bearer token into the request, and the code that does that kind of does that outside of your view. And then as the receiver of that request, my libraries and tools on that side can just essentially extract those from the bearer token and do whatever I need. And then all the subsequent downstream requests are essentially doing the same thing. So cascades through the entire system. Obviously, you still have the question of when do you validate the token? What's the lifecycle token? We probably don't have time to get into all of those bits, but that there are other things to think about that token. And as it comes into your microservice, you have to be sure it's a valid token. So if you're using API Gateway, you'll see authorizers used sometimes at the front door to be sure it's a valid token and so on.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, Todd, an interesting aspect of this question is, is it possible you might extract pieces of that JOT token? And the serverless reference architecture, again, is another interesting example here, right? Where they used their API Gateway Lambda authorizer to, take that token, determine what specific credentials they need to use downstream, and pass those credentials downstream as well to the microservices, so that the microservices may or may not need to even look at that JOT token, right? With the pieces of information that they want have already been put into the response. They could look at the JOT token. It's still there. We're not going to strip it out, but you have what you need to turn around and call S3 or call DynamoDB or whatever else. So that's pretty cool. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can handle that, but it's very flexible. I guess I'd say, I mean, if it's me, I'd like that JOT token to remain with the request through the whole process, just in case you do want to use it at some point, but you don't have to at every step.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that, like, use it or don't use it, it becomes part of the protocol of interaction between microservices, right? Like when I send this through, it's always sent through, because I don't know if somebody needs it downstream, even if I didn't need it. And ideally it's being passed through in a way that I don't even realize it's being passed through here in an ideal world. So you'll see a lot of the work and the tooling and the frameworks we have, like it just automatically picks it up and injects it into the downstream request.
Yeah, I'm going to bring this one up too, because he's sort of arrived at the same thing we're just talking about, right? It is easier to sometimes have that entry function and say, yes, I can stop the JOT token here, interpret it, do what I need to with the tenant identifier, and then still, you could pass it downstream or not, but have the other downstream systems use what that edge system is determined to be the useful part of the JOT token.
Yeah, that's what we did in the reference architecture. So we pull it out, and then what you'll see the downstream services taking is not so much the JOT token, but the tenant ID that was extracted at the edge.
Yeah,
I will just say I've seen both flavors of this. Some people are saying I don't want to, like, I'm treating each microservice as this autonomous system, and every entry into that autonomous system has to be not assume anything about an upstream interaction. I think that's sometimes not efficient, and I think you control where those boundaries are and those edges are. So, but it's more, can you afford the latency? Can you afford the overhead, and how does that affect your system, and what security sort of footprint you're after?
I've seen some other interesting use cases here, like Netflix specifically. I think they put out a great technology blog. And one of the articles I read in there was how they handled it, right? They've got all of these different kind of vectors into their system, right? Mobile or iPads or whatever. And how do you handle that across all of the different services? Because they're very much a microservice oriented architecture. And they ended up doing something pretty clever, which they took like a protobuf, which is just a format for stashing data, and they signed it, and then they passed that signed protobuf around. So it's kind of like a JOT token, but it's a little more efficient.
And I will add a nuance to this that isn't really related to authorizing it, but to me, we're talking about efficiency here. In a multi-tenant environment, that whole efficiency question gets even more complicated, because each request could be for a different tenant. So no matter how you're authorizing and validating the token, you may need to crack it open and get that context out on every single call. And that effort to crack it open and get that context out on every call can sometimes be added overhead that you don't want to assume. So you'll see us looking at different caching. The serverless SaaS architecture looks at this a little bit, right? Which is, I'll look at a request, I'll crack your token, and I'll make cache for some TTL, that information, to try to get a better efficiency out of this. And that'll connect to the downstream isolation efficiency as well. So another piece of the puzzle there that you want to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Any other questions there, Bill, or can we shift forward here?
Let's keep moving forward. We might pull some of them up as we go, but it looks like some of them are getting answers from the moderators as well.
Awesome. So the other thing I want to throw into this is that, I think today we're going to talk about identity through the lens of Cognito, because mostly we've built a lot of our solutions around Cognito because it's AWS identity service, right? But The reality is, and Toby hinted at this a little bit at the beginning, which is, your identity story, independent of JOTS or OIDC or how you're using bearer tokens, which provider you're using and what the source of that provider is and how much control you have over that provider is also part of this discussion, right? You may need to rely on getting your identity resolved from some third party, like some customer's identity provider, might even be a custom identity provider. And there's some challenges there with that as it relates to this JOT token and this notion of tenant context. So I don't know, Toby, maybe I'll again put you on the spot and let you and Bill sort of jump around this one. But what do I do if I don't own the identity provider and I don't own that whole JOT experience, and I've got to accommodate some hybrid or some mix of different providers?
Yeah, I think Cognito's got a pretty decent SSO federation story where you could do some SAML integration. I don't know what the good scale story is there necessarily. SAML is something that requires a whole bunch of kind of pre-configuration to exchange all those, the keys and everything ahead of time. So onboarding becomes a little more onerous, but it's certain, if you're talking about onboarding an enterprise, I don't think there's any expectation that it's a flip of the switch and you're up and running, right? Like, so it kind of, it falls in line with that. I don't know, Bill, you have any other thoughts there?
No, it's a great point, right? That as part of the onboarding story, we're always saying frictionless onboarding, frictionless onboarding. When you onboard an enterprise, you want it to be technically as frictionless as possible. There are probably still going to be some manual steps. And when I've talked to larger SaaS providers, the story that keeps coming up is, well, we've got to get this, identity story with them. Maybe they're using SAML. Maybe they've got some particular claims in their own Active Directory or whatever they're storing this. And federation can go so far. Federation, I don't know if we've actually defined the term, but when you actually take something like Cognito or Auth0 or Okta and connect to an external identity provider, we call that federation. And that federation can take a lot of flavors. Just sticking with Cognito for a second, we have a bunch of Lambda triggers that can sit on each of these events that happen with one of these external providers. And oftentimes you will have some real work to do to make sure that you've properly interpreted the payload coming back through SAML. If you're doing OIDC and connecting to social providers, there may be another layer you have to do to clean some of that data up. So it's an involved process, but it's still, imagine onboarding a customer with 10,000 users. I'd still rather do all of that work than try to recreate and have two sources of truth for those 10,000 users, right? Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, and I think that this notion of federation is I think sometimes people assume that if you go with a federated model, now you don't own the identity provider, so therefore you can't define which custom claims come in there. But the federation, especially with Cognito, not pushing Cognito, I'm sure other providers have some flavor of this they allow as well, will let you define in your own notion here in Cognito, like these are the additional claims I'm going to need. And when you onboard, I'm going to keep track of those so that when you authenticate against another provider, I can still stitch together a JOT token that is the marriage of the claims I need for you for my SaaS environment with the user sort of claims and other bits I got from the identity provider. And the good news of that is that merged sort of federated identity that flows downstream still looks like it has all the attributes you need, even if it came from your own native provider. So, but I still think there's a lot of complexities in that space, and the realities people face here are often beyond like the tools that are available out of the box. And so this can be, you have to sort of figure it out on your own. The advice I give people though is don't trade the one-off sort of customization for a customer for something that will be longer term better for you in terms of onboarding and bringing on customers at a faster pace, because you don't want to basically have your onboarding and the agility of your organization sort of handcuffed by the idea that every time somebody comes with this new flavor of identity, we got to go off and write some custom code. And now when we manage and operate and do everything else with them, we have to absorb that as one more pain point in our environment, right? So, and maybe there's not an ideal solution for everybody, but the automation here is worth it if you can figure it out.
Totally.
I guess the other piece of this is multi-region identity, right? So even if I'm all on Cognito, right, my footprint of my SaaS application maybe running globally, maybe running in different regions of the world. Like, what do we do? Do you have thoughts? So, like, what do we do when my identity is for somebody running in a GDPR centric region, right?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, when we start talking about regions, identity can get really complicated. And I'll step back from the question a little bit and say, if you're comparing identity providers, this is one of those key decision points where you have to make sure you understand your requirements from the beginning for multi-region. And I'll break that down a little bit. If you have a situation where you're talking about an active disaster recovery, for example, and you want those users to be able to, your users in an identity provider, to be able to turn around and log in instantly into a different region in the case of a disaster or an event, that story, you have to make sure that your identity provider can cover it. And the different identity providers have different versions of that story. So this is something I emphasize every time I hear identity and any sort of multi-region story with my customers. Make sure you've looked at your solution and understand how do they copy users between different regions? How are passwords synced up? Things like that. Now, all of that said, the multi-region story here of doing identity really is a lot of different layers. Do you have users trying to log in specific regions, or perhaps you're a multi-region solution provider and you have a US solution and an EMEA solution, but those users will never meet, right? Those are two separate pools of users for different tenants. They just happen to be in two different regions that you both run. That's one story, right? And that's less of a copying story than that disaster recovery story. So understanding the ins and outs of what you're trying to do across region, and understanding how your identity provider supports those is really important when you start to think about how you're going to solve these problems.
Absolutely. And I think for me, it's often overlooked scenario, which is you build this really robust identity thing in one region.
Yeah.
And then suddenly I want to expand and move into a new region. And then you find out, well, based on GDPR, like the identity can't leave the region. In fact, users can't move between the regions. So, and your onboarding and your auth flow, you may have single entry point, but then it's going to have a regional awareness. Where am I? And how do I, what are the migration stories for users between regions? Like there's a lot of moving parts. We'll do a whole nother show on multi-region SaaS at some point, but certainly I want to at least put it on the radar of, hey, we, as part of the identity story, you better, if you think you're going to be multi-region, you ought to step back from that and think about what your provider will support.
And just real quick, what's GDPR?
I don't know what does it stand for? It's the global compliance. You put me on the spot. I don't know the acronym off the top of my head.
No, that's good. That's good. I don't really.
It's probably what global data protection.
Maybe one of the mods can do that. Yeah.
It's essentially it is a set of rules that define the sovereignty of data in a region.
Yeah.
Google says general data protection regulation.
I was close. I just say GDPR and I know what it is, but gosh, I use the acronym so long you forget what it is.
Yeah.
But anyway, we promised code, and we said we'd sort of pivot to details here. And of course, as part of me saying we're going to promise code, I'm going to show you a slide first, because obviously everything with identity has two distinct paths to it, right? Identity has how do you actually get a tenant in, because how you get them into the system and how you create their footprint in the system, it directly influences how they're going to be able to be authenticated and what that authentication experience would look like. And this is one of the flows. Like, by the way, anytime we show you these things, they're not mean to be, they are the one and only way to do this. This is one of the flows that is common for onboarding. Toby, you want to walk kind of the basic moving parts of this?
Sure, and we won't dive too deep into this.
Don't go super deep on this. You just want to how do they get into the system? How do users get in?
This is touching on onboarding, which will probably have an episode dedicated solely to that. So we won't talk much about those bits. But the key point here is that once onboarded, in this particular scenario, we are using a Cognito user pool per tenant. So a complete siloed stack, if you will, on the identities or on the identity side. And so when a new user or a new tenant comes in, we provision, you can see there in probably step 5, we're provisioning a new user pool. We're adding all those custom claims and doing all the stuff we talked about earlier. And then one of the key points here is that we're stashing that user pool kind of based on tenant ID. So we have a big map that's stored in DynamoDB where we stash all of that information so that when that user comes back to us later, we could look up the identity settings that we need to authenticate against, and then just do the typical OAuth flow. So I think that's really all we have to talk about on this slide.
Yeah, I mean, all the big takeaway here is somewhere during your whole provisioning process, you have to decide how you're landing them, in this case, incognito or whatever else you're using, and how are you associating them with the tenant through maybe tenant management here, right?
Yeah, to be able to look up later. Yeah. And so here, this kind of goes through that. And I'll kind of point back to this slide. We won't flip back and forth, but I'll talk to this slide in a second when we get to the code. So, in this example, we've got tenant 1. They're running in a subdomain level. And again, this is indicative of the reference architecture, EKS SaaS reference architecture. We've provisioned a subdomain for them. They come in. The challenge that we faced was that in this particular case, it's hitting a SaaS application that is running out of a CloudFront distribution out of a single bucket, right? So it's one CloudFront distribution, of course, fanned out across the edge as CloudFront does, but everybody's hitting effectively the same chunk of JavaScript and HTML, right? So it's one website, if you will, that's being served to all these different browsers across the world. In this case, it just happens to be tenant 1. So that's the one piece of information that we have to identify, what tenant is actually running this. So in our case here, you can see in step 2 and 3, we take the origin of the caller and we exchange that for those. We use that for the lookup. So that's where it's happening. We hit this service, this application itself, before it's even rendered to the user, will exchange its origin for some authentication settings. And then in step 4, we're just loading up those settings into an authorization library, and we'll look at that, and just doing the normal OAuth flow, right? Nothing terribly magic here. And then once that flow is complete, step 8, we've got a JOT token. We can attach it to our request to the product service.
Now, Toby, I will say, because this is so for me, even when I first started kind of poking at this space, and the thing that sort of made me uncomfortable was I'm used to there being an identity provider, and I hit my web app, it just redirects the identity provider, all the auth happens there, and my code's out of the way, right? And in these multi-tenant environments, what we've seen is where people want to do subdomains, or they come in with all these different ways of sharing their tenant context, and then the identity mechanism could be slightly different for each tenant. It isn't always, but it could be. Yep. And so this is where this mapping kind of construct gets introduced, and I don't think it gets introduced lightly in a way that we're liking that we're sitting in the auth flow to some degree here. But so far, at least, we haven't seen good ways around this.
Yeah, we've got some simplification of this, and it's still in the works. There's nothing that's public on this yet, but we've got some folks internally that have kind of looked at this and have thought about using another mechanism altogether. Regarding, I think it has app mesh and some other OIDC proxies in there that handle a lot of this stuff more transparently. So that's not public yet; it's forthcoming, but simplifies this flow to a great deal. But at the end of the day, really what we're hoping to extract out of this is a JOT token with some tenant claims in it that we could use for downstream, or making sure that we're protecting resources correctly.
Okay, so you want to pivot over to your.
Yeah, let's do that. So this is, I'll first start off hey, I'm just in GitHub here. You can see we're in a SaaS factory reference architecture. I don't know if we've got a link to that, but if so, we could probably drop that in chat.
It wasn't a prior episode, by the way, I think. But
okay. Yeah, so this is, if anybody's ever used Angular, you'll recognize this file. This is our module, our app module. This is the guy that kind of kicks off the whole application. You can see that we've got some effectively what's bootstrap code here as part of our provider. We're saying, hey, we want you to go and configure the authorization for this application. Now, again, this code, this JavaScript code, is run before the first page is even rendered. It's loaded in and it runs through this process. And so what this configure auth function will do, and we're still in the client here. We're just looking at the SaaS application. I've got two functions in here, configure and configure dummy. One is just used when we're just doing local development. We don't have a whole Cognito user pool behind the scenes. But in the case that we do, we've got this configure function that just knows how to effectively call out to a member that in that previous slide, we saw that it was calling out to a tenant management service to fetch some settings. It's calling out to that tenant management service, and it's getting back this object called custom config that has a bunch of these things in here. So you can see that we've got issuer and redirect URL and all of those things that are particular, that are specific to that particular, to that client or that tenant's authorization settings.
So hang on, Toby. So I hit the configure on just landing on the page on the first bit you showed me.
Yep.
That hops me over to here, and you're essentially saying now I'm making some callback to tenant management here to get that mapping data. I'm not sure I saw where you made that call to tenant management.
That's happening. Params. So you can see params is calling a get call right there. So that's just an HTTP get to some URL. That URL is our API/auth info. So that's where it's calling out to the tenant management service. So the first thing you'd see is if you were to fire up this app and you were to open up your DevTools and just reload it, the absolute first call after the actual page has been brought into the browser is a call to that auth info to figure out how do I even authenticate? And the return of that would be this package that you see here of data that we use to then turn around and configure this little library that we've got in there called the OIDC service.
So basically, if I were building out this model in any framework, like, yes, it might look a little different depending on the stack, but you're essentially saying, hey, I come in, you're not authenticated. I don't even know where to authenticate you. I'm going to go out to this service that has this mapping because I know every tenant has their own user pool. I'm going to get, and I'm going to need the URLs and the other mapping data that's part of that. I'm going to fetch all that and collect that context so that I have it for the whatever's going to happen next in the authorization sequence. Authentication.
And so what that is all predicated on, obviously, is that when we've onboarded, we've somehow stashed all that information away as part of the onboarding process, right? Let me just real quick. That's the library we're using. It's one of the there's a handful of them that are certified by the OpenID Foundation. This just happens to be one we grabbed. No affinity for this one. There's just one that worked. So if you dig in there, you'll notice references to this guy. But going to the back end now, you can see that this is the actual method that we're calling when we go and fetch those settings, right? So we're bench through the control. This is an open method, so there's no authentication here. Nothing required. No, we don't. It's just open to the world. And what it does is it takes the tenant ID out of the caller. So it looks at we call it tenant ID. In this case, it's actually just the origin of the caller, right? So origin is a header that gets passed in the HTTP call. We grab that origin and we strip off the front, like what the subdomain is, and we use that to look up this information out of what's just basically a DynamoDB table.
Hey, Toby, let me just hop in really quick here and make a call back to what we were talking about before about what you put in the job token versus what you don't, because this is an interesting concrete example of you guys have a DynamoDB table and there's a whole bunch of tenant data in there that's all sort of metadata, right? That you don't have to shove into your jot token because you also have this table you can rely on, right? So just calling back to that to make sure you see that.
Good call out. There's configuration of the auth experience, and then there's the actual jot token, which it doesn't need all those same details.
Yep,
exactly.
So this guy just calls into Dynamo, grabs that item, and then we use that item. We pluck various pieces out of it to fill that information back. And then effectively what comes back is an object into the JavaScript that we could feed right into our OEDC library, and then it gets configured. And so once that happens, because we're using the Cognito hosted UI, the flow would go, you hit some service, it says you're unauthenticated. It tells the OIDC library, hey, go authorize this guy. And now the OAuth flow takes over. The OAuth flow says, how do I authorize? It goes and it looks in its kind of internal configuration. It says, oh, I see I have to go to some Cognito library or some Cognito URL. It goes there and gets presented with it's a 304 redirect to a URL. They get this nice little Cognito form, punch in their authentication details, and then that form will actually post back to a configuration that you can see here that is probably the redirect URL. which we've recorded as probably the page that requested it, right? So once you've authenticated, send me back to the page that requested it, except now it's going to have a code on the end of it, and then the exchange of the code for the token. And that's all handled transparently by the library. Like our code doesn't ever have to deal with it. It doesn't really look to see, did I get the code or anything else? It just happens to know that if I'm authenticated, there's a code in the sky that I can reach up and grab. Sorry, a token in the sky that I can reach up and grab for doing all of my authentication bits. So that's the back end. And I think the last piece here was just kind of showing how we've handled some of the abstraction. One of those libraries that we talked about, how we take this token manager and we grab the token out. I think I lost somebody.
Nope, we're here.
Okay, good. It got quiet. I was like, is that my internet?
No, you're just so riveting that we want to know more. And so we're being very quiet.
Okay. So this is just one of those functions that we use everywhere, right? We got this token manager, and we're pulling out the token, grabbing, extracting the tenant ID from that, and we're using that for logging. We're using that for dynamic isolation policies, that kind of stuff. When we go to reach into the DynamoDB for data, we wrap it with tenant ID so that we're making sure that we've got backup kind of boundaries around the security context of that. And that's really it. I was thinking there might be one other piece I wanted to show, but I don't have it.
Did you show the injection of you have easy access to the bearer token gets injected, maybe? Since
yeah. So we could do that real quick. I know where that is. So here we're in the injection of the bearer token onto the outgoing requests of the client.
Yes.
Yeah. So here we're in the application. We'll just go to, I think it's Auth Interceptor. So this and Angular, this again is an Angular specific way of doing this. There's other ways to do this, I'm sure. This guy just basically says, anytime we have an HTTP call, I want you to look at it and do something to it. So think of it as like a hook. In this particular case, if we don't have a token or we're trying to authenticate for the first time, we just say continue on. We don't want to do anything to it. Otherwise, if we do have a token and we're not trying to authenticate, then add this bearer token in the form of the token that, again, remember I said you could just grab it out of the sky. This token comes to us. Where is it? Yeah, right here. So we just get ID token out of that library again that was configured with all those settings.
Cool. Awesome. Well, let's go back here to our slides for a second. And obviously that's the flow there. And hopefully you can essentially see the moving parts of this now, where you came in the front door. We use this subdomain to get you the origin and look it up the details, and then essentially get you routed to the appropriate bits there. And I think the fact that a lot of helper code sort of surrounds all this is back to that theme we had at the beginning, which is these are things we don't want developers to have. So basically, by the time you get to this product and I'm the author of this product service, I got a JOT token, and libraries will help me figure out what to do with it in terms of implementing isolation or whatever, data partitioning, whatever else I'm trying to do over here. Now, just for contrast, because I think these concepts overlap a lot, though, I wanted to look at another model for implementing this, because I can't say enough that there are so many ways to do this. Even like Toby said, or maybe it was Bill, I can't remember, but even in that, like that example Toby that we described there, that Toby showed the code for, we've already had somebody come to us and say, oh, here's a cool way with service mesh where we can move a lot of this responsibility somewhere else that seems more natural, right? And probably 6 months from now, there'll be another cool way to do this. So we feel like this is a constant evolution. So, but here, just for contrast, this other serverless SaaS architecture, by the way, the stuff for which I'm showing you, I wrote none of it. So I'm sort of showing you the work of others. So we've had great people on our team that did great work on this, but they intentionally made tiering a big part of their solution. So if I come in as a basic tier tenant or a premium tier tenant, they wanted to show an infrastructure of their environment. And this included how it would affect identity. Instead of having just a user pool per tenant model, they wanted to say, hey, as a premium tier tenant, you'll get your own pool. And because you have your own pool, by the way, you can configure independently for each of those tenants. Do you want to use MFA? What's your security passwords? You get all these bonus things you can add to those premium tier tenants to say you configure your identity experience. But for the basic tier tenants, we're going to put you all in a shared user pool. And so here, we'll use groups and we'll use other things to sort of distinguish which one you're in, but you're basically all in one experience. And obviously now this adds a wrinkle to that whole experience, because now I don't just have to map you to a user pool. I have to know, wait, are you in the shared user pool, or do you have your own user pool, or what happens? And again, this comes back to affecting the onboarding experience. So we'll hop into that solution a little bit here. Let me add that to the screen and get my screen up here. So I sort of broke this down into two halves, and you're kind of going to get a slice into this where you'll kind of have to broaden out at some point and see the overall context. But I intentionally wanted to dig into some specific bits here. And I wanted to start by looking at the onboarding part of this, because the onboarding's key here, because especially where I have these different models I'm supporting based on your tier. So when we first spin up this environment, we have this bootstrap template that creates all the shared infrastructure that's needed for the environment. And obviously, because we're sharing a user pool for all pooled tenants, I can actually create that user pool ahead of time before there are any users in the system. I don't have to wait for an onboarding moment. I could still wait and delay that if I wanted. But so here you're seeing the bootstrap that creates all the stuff, the Lambda functions, everything that's like sort of just there by default at the beginning of the system. But within that, you'll see that I've got this actual, let me go back up. I went too far. It's Cognito right here. You'll see this line 55 right here shows me that I've got this nested template that's part of this experience. That is where the Cognito piece of this goes. And if I hop over to that nested template, you'll see here, this is where we're actually creating the user pool that is going to be the shared user pool for everybody. So at the very beginning, when I come in, I've got a user pool, but now if you onboard as a premium tier tenant, I still don't have a user pool for you yet. Now let's hop over to the actual code that's behind that when I actually onboard a tenant, right? So you'll see here when I come in, this is the register tenant function that's part of the onboarding process. So I've essentially filled out a form, given them my data and said, sign me up as a new tenant. And in this code, you'll see where we actually look at the tier of the tenant and we will decide, are you a platinum tier tenant? And oh, by the way, we do other things in here we're not going to wander off on, like your API key can be different for different experiences and throttling. But the important thing to take away here is you'll see this notion of dedicated tenancy set to true if I'm a platinum tier tenant. And when that gets set to true, now all the downstream things will say, oh, dedicated tenant means I have to do many different things for you, including a different identity experience. So you'll see here, I essentially go through this experience, and then I get down to this line here where I'm going to go create the very first user in the system, right? And that tenant admin user, of course, can't get created without without having a user pool. So now I'm jumping over into the what am I? And then I'm in the user management microservice here, and you'll see here I'm creating the pool, and it will default. We've shoved into some environment variables what the user pool ID and these other bits are going to be for the person who's a pooled tenant. Like, oh, these are the ones that are default if you're not dedicated. But you'll see once I get into the logic down here, you'll see, hey, it looks to see if you're dedicated. And then it actually says, oh, because you're dedicated, I'm actually going to go create a user pool for you. So you'll see right here, create user pool client. And I won't dig into all of that code, but essentially that code's going to go out. And in code, well, in fact, hey, let's wander down here a little bit. I'm navigating in the browser, so I don't have a lot of the shortcuts I'd have, but let's update the user. It's going to be down here in a second. Tenants, don't do enable user tenant. Oh, move to faster, Todd. Here it is, create user pool. And you'll see me now populating the claims and all the other things that I need to populate that are the classic things you saw me creating in the Bootstrap as also, but I was doing that in CloudFormation over there, whereas here I'm doing it in code. So when I get back from that process, I essentially now have a user pool created for that tenant. And now I can say, go create the actual tenant themselves. Like I know your user pool ID, I have all that other stuff. So if we were to go back to the tenant registration, you'd see the next step in the process is it calls out to create a tenant in the tenant management service. And here's where actually, you'll see this table here, which is a DynamoDB table, very much similar to what Toby's got, where it's going to put those details. And here's where it's going to actually store those details that include your pool. So now I either got your default pool because you were a pool tenant, a basic tier tenant, or I got this brand new pool that I created for you because you're a premium tier tenant. And from there, now if we go, sorry, lost my spot. If we go to this, the login bits, which is kind of where Toby was at, and now I'm over in the client. Now when I'm over in the client and I get into the, hey, you're not authorized, you need to get authorized, you'll see that that this service calls out to set tenant config. And what set tenant config does exactly the same stuff Toby was showing you, which is set tenant config essentially now goes and retrieves those settings that were stored in that DynamoDB table, populates them all, and then returns them here. They populate them into this OIDC security service, which is where the state of all those attributes are that need to be. And now it calls authorize, and now I'm good. I can go in. So pretty much a very mirroring a lot of what Toby had, but with the wrinkle of, again, I'm supporting multiple user pools here. So let me take that away. Boom. Well, let me just see real quick. I wanted to hop to this other. Yeah.
Yeah, that code I think shared the same heritage as the.
This should be the same setup, right? So here you'll see set OIDC config. This is essentially doing the same thing Toby's was, which is taping all these bits. And at this point, this code doesn't have to know whether this is a premium pool or whatever. It just knows I've got a pool ID, I've got a URL. I'll save those attributes, and now when I authorize, all those bits will work. So you could kind of see what this looks like now. You can imagine if you had like your own external provider, or you had some hybrid of these environments. Now you're going to have to even have more interesting bits in here. But I only wanted to show you these two because I feel like they highlight the fact that, like, in reality, you have to sort of step back and ask. It's kind of Bill's point. Like, what are you really trying to do? You said it in multi-region, but even not multi-region, like, what is your identity model, and how is that going to affect the code of your system?
I think we ought to. Do we have any of that content on the docket? Like some kind of federation, like and simulating, and maybe bringing up a Microsoft AD with some fake company and federating it into some sample SaaS app. That would be good stuff to put out.
I think you just volunteered, Toby.
Around that. Go ahead. Sorry, Bill. Oh darn! I missed the good one-liner.
No, he said I volunteered to do that, which I'd be happy to do. That'd be kind of cool. Yeah.
You have Microsoft heritage. You can go back and get your arms around AD, right? And all those bits. Love me some AD. So I guess for me, the pivot here as we start to move towards the end of this discussion is, when should I do this, right? Like, let's say I'm writing a brand new SaaS solution, or I'm migrating from a classic solution to SaaS. And I know that at some point we need multi-tenancy in our environment, but we don't have it yet. And when we're worried about like getting the features and functions of my system kind of working, where and when should I invest the time and energy in getting all these moving parts of identity working with multi-tenant awareness? Either one of you want to dive on that first?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I mean, it's one of those as soon as possible. So, I mean, there certainly is value, Todd, in something of a lift and shift, trying to get to SaaS as quickly as possible. And if you've already started storing you have your identity of your users inside of your siloed application, generally I would want that to be one of the first pieces. If you can't do that, you need to get live, and you're going to do a lift and shift into a single vehicle that's going to deliver this as SaaS. Just don't put it off, right? And the longer you put this off, the deeper the hole you're digging in terms of maintaining all those individual identities inside of what we would call your application plane, right? So do this as quickly as possible. Prioritize this. I think if you want to call back to the first episode when you asked, hey, what's the first thing you guys do when you're talking to customers who are moving to SaaS? I think most of us at Identity, Todd, you had a much more good and elaborate answer about trying to understand the customers and doing the story. But identity is really one of those first things you want to address. That's put it right up front.
About you, Toby?
Totally agree. Yeah, I mean, like, again, it echoes the conversation we had earlier, which is just gotta make sure you've got, to Bill's point, make sure you know what you're doing. Are you supporting enterprises? Maybe not. But if you are, do you have a story there? And if you're not, how are you setting it up? What's your IDP? All of that stuff. It's everything downstream is dependent on getting that right. So it's just a fundamental piece.
Yeah, for me, it's sort of a measure of, have you really thought about what multi-tenancy is going to mean to your whole system? To me, if I can go write a part of my system, and today it doesn't receive tenant context in the identity. Maybe it doesn't even have identity yet. Some people would start there. If I don't have to think about that when I'm writing a piece of code, I don't have to think about how to log with it. So our operations side of the house doesn't start to really get any tenant context in it. Metrics, well, we won't do metrics yet because we don't have tenant context. Right. Well, how am I going to do data partitioning? Well, let's just assume all tenants are just one partition right now. Like, you end up sort of trying to fake multi-tenancy, and in reality, you're making decisions kind of in the dark. Whereas if that tenant is sitting right there and that tenant context is at your fingertip, and you're being told, hey, for whatever I'm writing right now, I have to ask myself, what does tenant context mean to the thing I'm writing? Yeah. Well, it makes me put that in, bake all kinds of things in I might have otherwise missed. But I mean, everybody faces different realities and how quickly they're going to get there. But to me, it is one of those things. Like, I want you to get multi-tenancy in, and then I also want you to, this can push the isolation discussion. Like, okay, now 2 tenants are in. How do I make sure one tenant can't get to another? Well, if I don't have tenant context, I don't even have any way to start asking that question.
Right. And the pieces that just real quick, the pieces that you kind of alluded to, which I think is super important, and we'll probably talk at length about in another episode, but all of the optics, right? Like, if all you have is some kind of understanding of observability of your system in aggregate as a whole, and you got a tenant that's complaining that, hey, this is substandard kind of performance. If you don't have the ability to kind of dive in and look at that at tenant in isolation of all the other tenants, like, that's a huge customer issue, right? Like that would Anyway.
All right. Well, I do see that we're running up against time here, and I loved this discussion, by the way. I don't know.
I just wanted to pull this up. I mean, Todd, again, we've had really great audience participation here, and I wanted to pull this one comment up. I'm really excited that we have somebody who joined us from Italy. I think we have people from all over the globe on these shows, but I think it's just an important point here that SaaS is a global. It's growing globally. Right. We've seen it with our team, and I'm sure a lot of people in our audience have seen that SaaS is, as a delivery model for applications, growing dramatically. We're seeing a lot of growth in EMEA and APJ as well as North America. So I just wanted to call this out and say,
very cool call out, and very happy. We've got some global reach there, which we've seen across our program all along the way. So again, I probably can't really summarize here in the time that we have, but I will just say, hopefully you can see that the fundamentals of identity and it isn't dismissed as something that you just eventually need to do something about. It is fundamental to the SaaS story. The nice part is that, like, the basics aren't too hard, and really it's more about you threw me a question in the middle there. It's really more about, like, what is your strategy and how you're going to weave it all. Will there be an episode 3? Absolutely. Where this is a bi-weekly show. We have a whole slot. I'll be publishing sort of the list of upcoming shows here as we're starting to find our rhythm a little bit. But every 2 weeks we'll be here. We'll be recording a new show, and so please come back, join again. But anyway, we are at time. Thanks Bill and Toby for joining in the lively discussion. Really enjoyed getting to dive into this with you guys, and come back again for our next episode. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.